God bless you, everybody. It's your sister, Madeline Bruno. And today I want to read, right? I want to read this article that somebody wrote on, I'm going to tell you where it is. It's on gods411.blogspot.com. And it's how Jesus died for you on the cross, right? Like how much he suffered on the cross for us. This is unbelievable. I've read this so many times, and I read this, I would say, a few years back, and every time I read it, it just like, it breaks my heart. Like I start crying. It's really incredible and shocking just how much you suffer, in a crucifixion. It was one of the cruelest deaths and the most painful deaths that anybody could ever experience. And, I've been wanting to read this article and show you guys just how painful and like what he endured on that cross. It's so easy for people to say, yeah, he died on the cross for us, but this tells you in detail. So I mean, if you can't handle things like this, then don't listen to this video. It's really excruciating and sad, and hopefully I will not cry reading it, but I'm already feeling it. Oh gosh. But this is how much he suffered for us on the cross, right? So first and foremost, let's read. Now let me read to you. The crucifixion was invented by the Persians in 300 BC, but it was perfected by the Romans in 100 BC, right? So it is the most painful death ever invented by man, and is where we get our term excruciating, right? It was reserved primarily for the most vicious of male criminals, right? Jesus was stripped naked. First of all, he was stripped naked, and his clothing divided by the Roman guards. And this was fulfilled in Psalms 22:18, where it says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." The crucifixion of Jesus guaranteed a horrific, slow, and painful death. So Jesus' knees were flexed at a 45-degree angle, and he was forced to bear his weight with his muscles of his thighs, which is not an anatomical position which is possible to maintain for more than a few minutes without severe cramp in the muscles of his thigh and calf. Jesus' weight was borne on his feet with nails driven through them. As the strength of the muscles of Jesus' lower limbs tired, the weight of his body had to be transferred to his wrists, his arms, and his shoulders. So within a few minutes of being placed on the cross, Jesus' shoulders were dislocated. Minutes later, Jesus' elbows and wrists became dislocated. The result of these upper limbs dislocations is that his arms were 9 inches longer than normal, as clearly shown on the shroud. In addition, prophecy was fulfilled in Psalms 22:14, where it says, "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." After Jesus' wrists, elbows, and shoulders were dislocated, the weight of his body, of his upper limbs, caused traction forces of the pectoralis major muscles of his chest wall. These traction forces caused his ribcage to be pulled upward and outward in a most unnatural state. His chest wall was permanently in a position of maximal respiratory inspiration. In order to exhale, Jesus was psychologically required to force his body. In order to breathe out, Jesus had to push down on the nails in his feet to raise his body and allow his ribcage to move downward and inward to expire air from his lungs. His lungs were in a resting position of constant maximum inspiration. Crucifixion is a medical catastrophe. The problem was that Jesus could not easily push down on the nails in his feet because the muscles of his legs bent 45 degrees and were extremely fatigued, in severe cramp, and in an anatomically compromised position. Unlike all Hollywood movies about the crucifixion, the victim was extremely active. The crucified victim was psychologically forced to move up and down the cross a distance of 12 inches in order to breathe. The process of respiration caused excruciating pain mixed with the absolute terror of asphyxiation. As the 6 hours of the crucifixion wore on, Jesus was less and less able to bear his weight on his legs, and his thighs and calf muscles became increasingly exhausted. There was increasing dislocation of the wrists, elbows, and shoulders, and further elevation of his chest wall, making his breathing more and more difficult. Within minutes of crucifixion, Jesus became severely dysphonic, which is short of breath. Excuse the way I pronounce that word. His movements up and down the cross to breathe caused excruciating pain in his wrists, his feet, his dislocated elbows and shoulders. The movements became less frequent as Jesus became increasingly exhausted, but the terror of imminent death by asphyxiation forced him to continue in his efforts to breathe. I feel like I can't breathe right now. Jesus' lower limb muscles developed excruciating cramp from the effort of pushing down on his legs to raise his body so that he could breathe out in their anatomically compromised position. The pain from his two shattered median nerves in his wrists exploded with every movement. Jesus was covered in blood and sweat. The blood was a result of scourging that nearly killed him, and the sweat as a result of his violent involuntary attempts to expire air from his lungs. Throughout all this, he was completely naked, and the leaders of the Jews and crowds and the thieves on both sides of him were jeering, swearing, and laughing at him. In addition, Jesus' own mother was watching. Psychologically, Jesus' body was undergoing a series of catastrophic and terminal events. Because Jesus could not maintain adequate ventilation of his lungs, he was now in a state of hypoventilation. His blood oxygen level began to fall as he developed hypoxia, which is a low blood oxygen. In addition, because of his restricted respiratory movements, his blood carbon dioxide levels began to rise, a condition known as hypercritical. The rising CO2 levels stimulated his heart to beat faster in order to increase the delivery of oxygen and the removal of the CO2. The respiratory center in Jesus' brain sent urgent messages to his lungs to breathe faster as he began to pant. Jesus' psychological reflexes demanded that he took deeper breaths, and he involuntarily moved up and down the cross much faster, despite the excruciating pain. The agonizing movement spontaneously started several times a minute, to the delight of the crowd who jeered him, the Roman soldiers, and the Sanhedrin. However, due to the nailing of Jesus to the cross, his increasingly exhaustion, he was unable to provide more oxygen to his oxygen-starved body. The twin forces of hypoxia, which is too little oxygen, and hypercapnia, which is too much CO2, caused his heart to beat faster and faster as Jesus developed tachycardia. Jesus' heart beat faster and faster, and his pulse rate was probably 220 beats per minute, the maximum normally sustainable. Jesus had drunk nothing for 15 hours since 6 p.m. the previous evening, so Jesus had endured a scourging which nearly killed him. He was bleeding from all over his body following the scourging, the crown of thorns, the nails in his wrists and feet, and the lacerations following his beatings and falls. Jesus was already very dehydrated, and his blood pressure fell alarmingly. His blood pressure was probably about 80/50. He was in first-degree shock with hypovolemia, which is the low blood volume, and tachycardia, which is excessive fast heart rate. tachyphonia, which is excessively fast respiratory rate, and his hyperhidrosis, which is excessive sweating. So by noon, Jesus' heart probably began to fail. Jesus' lungs probably began to fill up with pulmonary edema, right? This only served to exacerbate his breathing, which was already severely compromised. Jesus' heart was in heart failure and respiratory failure. That's why Jesus said, "I thirst," because his body was crying out for fluids. He was in desperate need of an intravenous infusion of blood and plasma to save his life. Jesus could not breathe properly and was slowly suffocating to death. At this stage, Jesus probably developed hemopericardium, plasma and blood gathered in the space around his heart called the pericardium. This fluid around his heart caused cardiac tamponade, which is fluid around his heart, which prevented Jesus' heart from beating properly. Because of the increasing psychological demands on Jesus' heart and the advanced state of hemopericardium, Jesus probably eventually sustained cardiac rupture. His heart literally burst. This was probably the cause of his death. To slow the process of death, the soldiers put a small wooden seat on the cross, which would allow Jesus the privilege of bearing his weight on his sacrum. The effect of this was that it could take up to 9 days to die on a cross. My goodness. When the Romans wanted to expedite the death, they would simply break the legs of the victim, causing the victim to suffocate in a matter of minutes. This was called crucifixion. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus says, "Tetelestai," meaning it is finished. At that moment, he gave up his spirit and he died. When the soldiers came to Jesus to break his legs, he was already dead. Not a bone of his body was broken in fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus died after 6 hours of the most excruciating and terrifying torture ever invented. Jesus died so that ordinary people like us will go to heaven to be with him. So I'm sorry for my emotions, but every time I read this, it's unbelievable how much he suffered, So what I want to say to you, if you don't know Jesus and you want to accept him as your Savior, all you have to do is simple things, right? You have to admit that you're a sinner. Confess and profess that he is your Savior. You have to accept him into your heart. You have to ask him for forgiveness, right? Believe and confess that Jesus is Lord. And believe in your heart that he's Lord. And when you're in trouble, you call out to him. And he will save you. So thank you again for listening to this message. And if you want to read it for yourself, you can find it at gods411.blogspot.com. And I'm going to see if I can leave a link below where you can read it. God bless you guys. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.